You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 2nd of June 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello there and a warm welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Emma Nelson, and coming up on today's programme, a second round of negotiations begins between Russia and Ukraine. But with Ukraine's weekend attacks on Russia's strategic bombing fleet, we'll ask who has the upper hand this time. Also coming up in the next 30 minutes.
I'm Adam Hancock at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, where I've sat down with Australia's Deputy Prime Minister to talk about security issues in this region.
We'll hear more from Adam as he tells us what the priorities were for the region, plus why the price of rice has forced Japan's agriculture minister to step down. And
delegates from over 100 countries, and IATA has also updated its reference to India. It is now the third largest aviation market in the world.
Good news for India, but why are Donald Trump's tariffs causing problems for the world's travel market? All that coming up right here on The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. This weekend, Ukraine mounted a surprising and impressive attack deep into Russian territory. Lorries parked near to petrol stations across the country launched drones, which then went on to destroy an estimated $7 billion worth of Russian bombers. Moscow retaliated last night, but the attack has set the tone for today's talks between Ukraine and Russia in Istanbul. Well, watching events is Monocle writer and researcher Julia Lassica. She joins me in the studio. Good afternoon, Julia.
Good afternoon, Emma.
This was quite a weekend, wasn't it, that has been compared in some ways to the way that Israel and the pages against Hamas.
Yes, and Russian war bloggers, for example, called it Russia's Pearl Harbor. I mean, obviously, there are a few things off with that analogy, but I think it just really shows how momentous this was, really, for Russia and for Ukraine, for both sides, and I think also for America and Europe watching on. And I mean, the Ukrainian side were jubilant. We had, my favourite thing was that the Ukrainian special service that launched this attack, they quoted one of Ukraine's greatest poets, and she wrote, Lina Kostenko, and she wrote a poem which was, Ukraine is not simple, Ukraine is exclusive, and Ukraine has the ability to surprise. And I think they were really channeling her poetic, prophecy there with this attack.
It happened just before a second round of talks in Istanbul. And we have to look at the context of this because Russia and Ukraine are now, second round of talks. We don't know exactly what happened in the first round, but how much does what happened over the weekend set the tone of the talks in Istanbul?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, today Zelensky is meeting with the various northern Eastern European nations, and he said that now is the moment where Putin is finally being called to engage with diplomacy, because now this attack has been launched. Russia has been caught off guard. Putin is completely silent. There has hardly been a reaction from the Russian side, and I mean, the scale of the loss that they've undertaken here is just enormous, really, and it hits them really, really hard in their one big card, which they keep playing, if we're talking about cards like Trump and Putin like to do, and it's their nuclear threat, so that 20% of their nuclear kind of ability now is wiped out with these bombers, and these bombers are no longer being made, that their kind of manufacturing is over, so they can't actually remake these bombers that were destroyed. So Ukraine is coming into this very confident. They've added, we know now, into their sort of plans that they've shared with Reuters, with other news outlets, is that Russia will be asked to pay reparations. And that's a big ask, I think. And they're really playing, to their strengths here. Russia has still not released their sort of list of demands from Ukraine, but we know exactly what they will be. It will be Ukraine can't join NATO, Ukraine can't do this, etc., etc. New to Ukraine, take away its military capabilities. But I think now that NATO is looking at this, I mean, this is a sort of military genius that NATO really needs to be learning from as well.
What are they able to talk about, though, that could actually lead to some breakthrough? Because if you go into talks on both sides saying that there are red lines that cannot be crossed, not much is going to happen.
Yeah, I don't think that anyone really expects much to come out of the talks today, but I think the scene has been set for breakthroughs. And I know that, for example, we've been following this together on Monocle Radio about Senator Lindsey Graham. He's been doing his European tour with presenting his sanctions package. So he now has 82 senators in the US who are supporting his sanctions package. This is a sort of secondary sanctions package that would target China and India to pressure them into pressure Russia to end the war. And Lindsey Graham has said that China has to be part of the pressure to make Russia end the war. And, you know, Lindsey Graham has met with Zelensky, he met with Macron, and today he's meeting with the German FM. So I think there are lots of sort of machinations that are now in the works, lots of things happening. And I think today, Russians will go into this slightly more sober than last time. Last time they were telling Ukraine, you know, we know that they were saying your family members will die in this war and we won't stop fighting this war and we will take more territory from you. And they were demanding Ukraine give up territory that Russia does not yet hold. So I think hopefully, you know, they'll be going into this more sober, but I don't think we're expecting any huge breakthroughs.
What about the way that Ukraine could well be seen now by the United States? I mean, you mentioned discussions taking place within Europe and Washington. But up until now, there has been the assumption, perhaps from Washington, that Ukraine will lose. And it is just a matter of time. And so that any discussions or negotiations have to be on the premise that Russia will ultimately win this war. The attacks at the weekend, does this change in any way the manner in which Washington must see Ukraine?
Well, it directly affects Washington because these bombers that were targeted were flying over and creating incursions into American airspace. And America has really been worried about this coming in from the east, from the far side of Russia into American airspace. So this directly affects them. These bombers will now no longer be doing that. I think also, like you've said, it sort of changed the feeling. We've seen Ukraine do this at several points in the war, but this is momentous. And what's really fascinating is that this operation was started a year ago. This has been in the works for such a long time, and isn't it incredible that it has really come to fruition at such a pivotal moment in the war? We expected going into these peace talks that, yes, it's sort of inevitable. America will again be sort of bowing to Russia's pressure, etc., etc. But now it's really changed the game, and it's exciting to see what actually comes out of this.
Julia Lessiger, Monocle writer and researcher, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to The Briefing with me, Emma Nelson. The time here in London is 7 minutes past midday. A look now at some of the day's other news headlines. Here's Carlotta Rebello.
Thanks, Emma. Conservative nationalist Karol Nawrocki has been elected Poland's next president, beating the Liberal mayor of Warsaw, Rafał Trzaskowski, in a close election held on Sunday. Nawrocki's election represents a setback for Poland's Liberal and pro-European Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Shares in South Korean and Vietnamese steelmakers have tumbled after US President Donald Trump announced over the weekend that he was doubling tariffs on global steel imports to 50%. European steel stocks have been mixed as many have operations in the US, while shares in American steel companies have surged in pre-opening trading on Wall Street. And the designer Jonathan Anderson has been confirmed as the creative director of the fashion house Dior, succeeding the Italian designer Maria Grazia Chiuri, who held the position for nearly a decade. Anderson's Dior menswear debut will be shown later this month, and his first women's ready-to-wear collection is planned for Paris Fashion Week in October. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Emma.
Thank you very much indeed, Carlotta. Now to Singapore, where the annual Shangri-La Dialogue took place this weekend. The Security Summit usually provides a platform to face-to-face talks between defence chiefs from China and the United States. But this year, Beijing sent a much lower-level delegation. The forum focuses on regional security issues across the Asia-Pacific, with some 47 countries represented. Adam Hancock was there and sent us this report.
For one weekend every year, the lobby of this luxurious central Singapore hotel feels a little bit different. It's filled with military officials, media and the odd world leader, as well as a few very confused holidaymakers. Defence chiefs from around the world have gathered here to attend Asia's premier defence forum, the Shangri-La Dialogue. This summit is usually an opportunity for defence ministers from the US and China to hold a rare face-to-face meeting. But this year, Beijing declined the invitation. It meant that all eyes were on US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth as he made a much-anticipated speech.
It has to be clear to all that Beijing is credibly preparing to potentially use military force to alter the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. We know, it's public, that Xi has ordered his military to be capable of invading Taiwan by 2027. The PLA is building the military needed to do it, training for it every day, and rehearsing for the real deal.
In order to counter this apparent threat, Hegseth advised Washington's allies in this region to build up their own defences.
NATO members are pledging to spend 5% of their GDP on defense, even Germany. So it doesn't make sense for countries in Europe to do that while key allies in Asia spend less on defense in the face of an even more formidable threat.
Hegseth's speech was condemned by Beijing, with China's foreign ministry saying it was intended to sow division. But the US Defense Secretary is not the only person here expressing concern about China's military might. I sat down with Australia's Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister, Richard Marles.
What we've seen in relation to China is the biggest conventional military build-up that the world has seen since the end of the Second World War. That's no small fact, and it hasn't happened with strategic reassurance. What China's intent is in building up in that way is unclear, and so that is our concern in respect of China. That's not new. We've been articulating that concern for some time, and indeed China has been engaging in this military build-up for some time.
And as Mr. Hegseth said, would you advise countries in this region to be spending more on defence now, to be building their armouries?
Look, I'm not about to tell other countries what to do in respect of this, but I would make the point that we all need to be making a contribution to the security of our region. It is really important that we have an American presence in the region. That does help maintain a balance. But as I said yesterday in my speech, it can't be left to the US alone. We need to be all making our contribution to the security of the region in which we live.
Is there any updates you can share on AUKUS from this weekend?
Well, look, AUKUS is proceeding well. It really does bring us all three countries much more closer together in terms of submarine capabilities, and that's very much the case in terms of our relationship with the United Kingdom. We are working really closely with the UK, with BAE, who will be the critical partner in respect of the delivery of the submarines that we will be building in Australia with BAE, and we're very happy about that progress.
This weekend's summit was also an opportunity for the US to reaffirm its commitment to its allies in this region. President Trump's tariffs have targeted a number of Asian countries, leaving some of America's closest friends questioning if they can still rely on continued support from Washington. Zach Cooper is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I asked him if Pete Hegseth had done enough to convince the doubters.
I think he cleared the bar that people had set for him. Expectations were low, but I think he was reassuring that the U.S. cares about the Indo-Pacific broadly. I'm not sure that he was very reassuring about Southeast Asia in particular. And we're here in Singapore, and I think a lot of countries in this region would have liked to hear more about why Southeast Asia matters to the United States, not just the broader Indo-Pacific region.
One of the other big talking points at this year's dialogue was Beijing's decision to keep their defence minister at home. It's the first time since 2019 that China's defence chief has been absent from the summit, with Beijing giving no explanation for Dong Jun's no-show. I went looking for answers and asked Yongfei Zhao, a defence reporter with Chinese state media network CGTN.
What we understand is that it's quite normal for the Chinese Defense Ministry not sending its minister. According to what they're saying, that this really doesn't hurt the message that China wants to deliver, because basically China's defense policies has been quite consistent from time to time. So certainly the level of people attending the event may not hurt the message being delivered.
Sure. And what has been the response in China to the speech on Saturday from Pete Hegseth, the US Defence Secretary? He had a lot to say in that speech, some very strong words on China.
There are a lot of Chinese netizens discuss this issue when I was on site listening to the speech delivered by Hegseth. Second part of the speech is really anti-China, and I don't think it's polite to target any specific country. My colleague did a calculation. He mentioned China for more than 20 times. So this is really an aggressive statement, and it's really not okay for a conversation, a platform like the Shangri-La Dialogue.
Mr. Hegseth said that the threat from China was real and potentially imminent. What's your reading on that?
I don't understand where the narrative comes from. I mean, how many wars China has launched in history? How many wars that the United States have launched in history? If you look at the history, that China is really a country that wanted for peace.
The Shangri-La Dialogue was created to help ensure global peace. It's meant to be a platform where military leaders can sit down and discuss the major issues of our time. But with China absent and the US calling for more regional defence spending, the prospects of global peace are looking increasingly unlikely. Reporting from Singapore for Monocle Radio, I'm Adam Hancock.
Thank you, Adam Hancock, based out in Singapore for us. Well, we'll stay at the Shangri-La Dialogue because France's president was lending his voice to things. He's called for a coalition of independents to offer what he said was an alternative to the dominant voices of the US and China. Emmanuel Macron told a gathering of the Southeast Asians at Shangri-La that the world needed an alliance which refuses to systematically align with either Washington and Beijing. Well, Monocle's Paris Bureau Chief Simon Bouvier joins us now from the Paris Bureau. He's been following things. A very good afternoon to you, Simon.
Bonjour, Emma. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Now let's look at this. Adam in Singapore was laying out there the fact that it was China versus America, what voice they had, how many people they sent, what the level of the delegation was. And in the middle of this is Emmanuel Macron saying, no, there's a third way here.
Absolutely, Emma. And I think in his speech, first of all, it's notable that he was the head of state who was invited to pronounce this opening speech, perhaps because of the lack of other high-level participants, even though Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was there. I think, he really is keen on creating this third way, what he calls a third way, that's kind of in between the influences of China and the United States. As we know, the United States has been increasingly withdrawing from international commitments, and that's been making its historic allies in the region nervous, and China has been increasingly assertive, so that has the same effect. So, he's not reinventing the wheel here. He's been saying something similar since 2018, but what might be different this time, Emma, is that the behavior of both the US and China might make this prospect of a third way led by Europe and France more tempting to the countries in the region.
Indeed, because Macron was talking about spheres of influence which have become spheres of coercion, referring to exactly what China and the US are doing. And in the audience is the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who didn't look that impressed.
No, I think, though, that Macron's rhetoric mirrors what a lot of the media reports that we're seeing out of the United States that say that, President Trump and his administration are increasingly leaning towards kind of 19th century great power competition worldview, which sees the United States, Russia, and China splitting up essentially the world map and saying, okay, well, you have influence over these parts and I have influence over these parts. So Pete Hegseth is the vehicle for this new vision, no matter how kind of conventional he tried to sound at this Shangri-La dialogue. And essentially Macron called his bluff.
Calling his bluff is one thing, but questions have been asked that Europe does want to take part in this. Macron wants to place Europe front and centre of a third way. But what is it that Europe can offer which is new and tempting?
I think that's a great question, Emma, especially because the last notable thing to happen in the region, earlier in the show, we talked about AUKUS, and the Australians are saying, this agreement between the UK, the US, and Australia is going swimmingly, although the background for that is that in Australia, they had to turn their back on a previous agreement that they had signed with France to provide nuclear submarines to Australia, and that kind of blew up in France's face. And completely destroyed their credibility as a kind of Indo-Pacific power, which France claims to be because of the location of some of their overseas territories there. And so, Macron has been making the same noises for years, but with that in the background, I think a lot of countries in the region again, I think won't be necessarily tempted to align with Europe because of Macron and what he's saying, because that has been consistent. But the radical change in behavior from the US and the increase of assertiveness of China might tempt them to hedge their bets here.
Well, I have you, Simon. Can we just touch briefly on the fact that Emmanuel Macron is presenting a very unified and peaceful face to the rest of the world. Yet the mere victory of Paris Saint-Germain on the weekend has caused enormous domestic unrest, a rather surprising level, one would say.
Yes, I think it's more about whether or not the security apparatus that was deployed to anticipate what kind of wildness might occur should Paris Saint-Germain win was not sufficient. The Interior Minister, Bruno Retailleau, who is kind of the man of the moment in French politics right now because he is seen as the quote-unquote presentable rights would-be candidate for the presidency. So he has been kind of climbing in the opinion polls in recent months. And this is his first major setback. The football here was the pretext for this violence, but it didn't really, according to the evidence that we can see now, obviously that's still fresh and investigations are ongoing, but it's more troublemakers taking advantage of, the streets and the Champs-Élysées being completely thronged with football fans to stir trouble rather than football fans kind of becoming unruly and more.
Simon Bouvier, Monocle's Paris bureau chief, joining us from our bureau in Rue Bachamont in Paris. Thank you so much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. It's 2021 in Tokyo, which is where we head next, because Japan is experiencing a severe rice shortage. And as a result, the price of rice, Japan's staple food, has doubled in just 1 year. It's also forced the resignation of the agriculture minister, who claimed, "I've never had to buy rice. I get it from my supporters." Well, James Sims is a journalist and commentator in Tokyo. Good evening, James.
Oh, good evening.
So just explain to us, if you are going out to buy your daily staple of rice, what do you experience in the shops?
Well, one thing is there's usually a limit in terms of being able to buy only one bag, and that's like a 5-kilogram bag, which at current prices for normal Japanese rice would be about, I think, 5,000 yen or 26 pounds. And then it's in the news every day. It's like the top news on the national public broadcaster, what's happening with rice, what the government is doing, what the new minister is doing. So it's definitely on everybody's mind.
All consuming. What's caused the shortage?
Well, last year they had a very bad harvest, so they're about, I think, 400,000 tons short. And then there have also been questions about the Japan Agricultural Cooperative, just in terms of how much it's actually releasing, because they're trying to keep the prices up, obviously, for the farmers. And I think the prices, just in terms of inflation, have not kept up with the higher input costs. So theoretically, you could argue that rice prices should actually be higher, but consumers have been used to, relatively low rice prices, especially in the last few years when other staples have gone up, such as wheat, which are used, for bread, and Japanese staples like ramen.
And this has led to a Marie Antoinette moment from the agriculture minister, who said, "I've never had to buy rice. I get it from supporters." This will have not resonated well with the electorate.
Yes, it was quite I think, a foolish thing to say. I think he was just trying to joke. But actually not being able to sort of read the room or, read the room across the country. So yes, Minister Ito had to fall on his sword, or I think he was more pushed out because the Japanese prime minister, who's only been in power for about 10 months, he's facing an upper house election next month. And so this is something that he does not want to be weighing on voters' minds, that he has ministers that are out of touch with the populace.
The government has a stockpile of rice. What's it doing with it?
So it's starting to release more of that directly to retailers to try to cut out the sort of the middlemen who are obviously going to be taking a margin. And so that seems to have brought some of the prices down to about, they've been talking about trying to get it around 2,000 yen, which is about 10 pounds for 5 kilos. But what they're releasing are stocks that are from like 2 or 3 years ago. And so there've been very, I guess, important questions about, what is it going to taste like? Because there's, I guess, concerns that it's maybe the taste has become a bit off because it's been sitting around in a warehouse. And so that's one question. And I guess the broader question that the government needs to address is that they've had a policy to try to reduce the agricultural production to try to maintain prices, but also to deal with the falling farmer population. So right now, the average age of the farmer is close to 70, and there are very, very few people that are actually wanting to get into farming, even though Japan, potentially has a very large export market that they could be, producing agricultural products for, including rice, which, as you probably know, sushi has become very popular around the world. And in some of the, I guess, the higher end places, they actually use Japanese rice instead of using, for example, the United States, they would be using California rice.
James, just finally and briefly, there is a prospect that Japan might have to import rice from overseas. That is an enormous move.
Yes, they do have what they call minimum access, for example, with the United States from previous trade agreements. So they could import a certain amount of rice without any sort of tariffs. And so that would be one way to get around it. And they do, for example, the United States and California, and I think in Arkansas, grows what they call the Japanese short grain rice, like a cow rose. And I remember the last time that the rice issue was this large was probably about 30 years ago. And they actually imported rice from Thailand, but most of that ended up not being eaten and actually used for aid to countries that were facing food shortages. But the thing is, for example, the Thai rice and maybe some of the other long grain rices, they can be eaten with other things other than Japanese food. Japanese do eat a lot of curry. So, it's something that they could eat it with. But just in terms of the staple, Japanese want that short grain Japanese rice, which is actually, I've compared the rice, in the United States and Japan, and the Japanese rice is actually very, very good. So I could see why people would be clamoring for, the Japanese rice.
James Sims in Tokyo, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing. Finally, on today's programme, the world's airlines have warned that trade wars and the associated lack of consumer confidence are putting pressure on them. The warning has come at this year's gathering of the International Air Transport Association, IATA, in New Delhi. And joining me now is Paul Charles, founder and CEO of the PC Agency. Good afternoon, Paul.
Good afternoon.
Is this a genuine profit warning that we're hearing here?
It is somewhat of a profit warning. There are certainly headwinds in the aviation sector that airlines are having to deal with at the moment, ranging from tariffs being introduced through to delays in getting new aircraft delivered, and of course, inflation causing prices to go higher. So there are certainly headwinds which are causing profits to be reduced, or indeed airlines to report losses for the last quarter, but it's still a healthier picture than it has been for some time.
Indeed. With so many forecasts that life is back to pre-COVID levels, if not better. The fact that we are going into a period of instability of unknown duration, is there a real sense that we need to be worried about this, or is this just something which airlines can pivot and bend and flex with?
Airlines and those working in the industry are used to having to be flexible and having to pivot. Let's put it in perspective. IATA, the International Air Transport Association, is saying today that they expect fewer than 5 billion air journeys to take place this year, 5 billion, compared with their previous forecast of 5.22 billion. So it's a little bit down. Airlines are used to headwinds such as not being able to fly over countries, such as trade wars. They deal with it all the time in the geopolitical space. I think what's different now is that there are plenty of uncertainties as opposed to 2 or 3 uncertainties. There's still war taking place in the Ukraine-Russia region. You have the Middle East conflict still dominating whether airlines can fly into Israel. You have the tariffs, of course, and what's taking place that may affect cargo and the ability to put cargo into America. So all of these are big issues that airline bosses are having to deal with, and that means that they're having to make some pretty tough decisions about where their aircraft are flying to, and of course how they fill the plane itself, how they fill it in terms of business travellers being lower, and whether leisure travellers who are compensating for that gap are paying more in terms of premium pricing.
Indeed. I mean, how does that all set the tone for the fact that the Northern Hemisphere is just about to dive into summer season?
It's traditionally, of course, the busiest period of the year, and this summer's bookings are looking very strong indeed. Most people booking for the summer book in the January-February period, so that was before the tariff issue really came to the fore, and people will not give up their vacations. They are very resilient. They want to travel in the summer period. And of course, for some families, they can only travel in the summer period when schools are out. So the summer will be strong for airlines. Many of them are actually making a lot more money. The pricing is higher. You're paying a lot more to travel both short haul and also long haul, especially across the Atlantic. So they're going to have a good summer. Of course, airlines need to also have a good period between October and March to make up for a traditionally lower travel period.
Paul Charles, CEO of the PC Agency, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing. And that's all the time we have for today's edition of the programme. Many thanks to all my guests and to the producer Chris Chermak. Our researcher was Francesca Jilks. Our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. The Briefing's back tomorrow at the same time. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.